Leading stories, trending topics, changing narratives. You're listening to the Critical Conversations podcast.
Welcome to Critical Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Rick Daniels, Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion, right here at Oakton College. On July 29th, the Department of Justice released new guidance for federally funded organizations, warning that certain diversity, equity, and inclusion practices may violate federal anti-discrimination laws. The memo makes clear that even well-intentioned efforts, such as affinity programs, targeted recruitment strategies, and inclusive physical spaces, could result in loss of funding or legal risk. Today, we're unpacking this guidance with a particular focus on higher education. Joining me are three of Oakton's finest, who will help us to explore how the letter interprets Title VI, what it means for DEI initiatives, and how Oakton might effectively respond moving forward. Welcome to the Oakton table, everybody. I want to give you the chance to introduce yourselves. If you could, give us your first and last name and tell us about your role at the college, and then we're going to get into our discussion.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for having me here today. My name is Sylvia Rosillo. I am an associate professor in the library. I'm also the student engagement coordinator here within the library, so I do a lot of programming and events across campus with a bunch of campus partners. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right. I'm Dear Aunaetitrakul. I'm a senior program manager for the AANAPISI program here at Oakton College. Oakton College became the first community college in the state of Illinois to earn the Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander Serving Institution. And so we got a 5-year grant, and I oversee the project.
My name is Keith Simonds. I'm assistant professor of political science, so I teach things like American government, international relations, and other related courses that are relevant to this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here, and welcome to the Oakton table. This is where we're going to gather and have some conversations around, particularly this letter today. Keith, you are a friend to the show, and you've been here quite a few times. You do an excellent job of giving an overview and a breakdown of how what's happening in the larger society, particularly in political science, impacts all of us. Can you help us out with giving us an overview of the DOJ letter, and in particular, talk about and elaborate on how some of the more specific claims impact our work?
Right. So one thing that's very confusing about all of this is this entire memo really concentrates on DEI, but it's also in some ways not about DEI at all, in the sense that no laws have changed, no courts have found that DEI is problematic according to our civil rights acts that are on the books. This is entirely about how the Trump administration is choosing to interpret existing civil rights law and use executive power in the ways they can, and in some ways that are questionable, and that we're seeing the courts try to figure out right now. So one example is any executive order that a president issues can just be revoked by a future president. And President Johnson in 1965 put out an executive order that required federal contractors to practice anti-discrimination and encourage things like affirmative action in hiring through federal subcontractors and contractors. That's been revoked, so that means the federal government is no longer doing that. And that's something the government absolutely can do. Executive orders, you live by them, you die by them, so that's gone. But one thing that is very difficult in trying to understand the memo is the way they're trying to deal with DEI is saying that DEI programs may, and the key word is may sometimes be running afoul of anti-discrimination law. They specifically talk about Title VI and VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title IX of the Education Amendments. And so basically what we're talking about here is prohibitions in Title VI based on race, color, national origin that were put into place. Title VII that has to do with employment discrimination and preventing the same kinds of groups from being discriminated against. And then we have Title IX of the Education Amendments that has to do with discrimination based on sex in education. So they're saying that if DEI programs do certain things, like have groups that are entirely exclusive to one race, that no one else is available, that could be a violation of civil rights law and could lead to the loss of federal funding. And so again, the ways they're using the words DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion are
illegal. DEI.
Right.
That was a very
DEI.
specific word used.
And so we just don't know where the line is properly drawn. The one way to read this is they're trying to provide some clarity, and in some places they do. But once we get to the recommendations, for example, it gets very, very confusing again.
Yeah. Recommendations is an interesting word. Before we get to that, I want to open up the floor and talk about any other general thoughts around the letter itself. In particular, let me throw a toss-up question out there. I would love to know how you felt when you first read it, because I know for me, there was a range of emotion, especially with the tone of the letter and the way in which it targets very specific aspects of my job personally, and I imagine yours as well. Tell me about just some of your general thoughts around it and how it resonated with you.
Well, like Keith mentioned, like, these are best practices, right? These are supposedly best practices that that with their interpretation and using the language of illegality, right, to interpret DEI. So I think that's what stood out to me. It's not mandatory, but it's best practices. But then it's best practices with the risk of taking money away, right? So how much do you have to? We're in this kind of middle ground of trying to figure out, all right, how do we do what we're doing, and how do we continue to protect our students, with this risk of having funding taken away, or like at risk of possibly not getting funding, or possibly having complete programs disappear at Oakton. And it just made me realize personally, I think I had to step away a few times from my monitor, because it made me upset to think about how far we've come to see representation, to see students, come to higher ed, join the academy, and what's at risk now for those populations, right? Like, what's at risk for Latinos who are joining or who are graduating high school, right, just now, or who are just starting their week 1 or week 2 now, right? Week 2, semester 1, right? So that's really disheartening to think that this is all at risk. This is all risk. And I was very upset. Yeah.
I don't know. I come in with a different mentality, though, because before Oakton, before anything, I used to live in Texas in 2016 when they started rolling back the anti-DEI. So with the SB 117 or SB 17, don't remember the exact number, right? So I've been in this whole like anti-DEI rollback for almost 10 years. So when I see the DOJ letter, or even, the beginning of the year where there was a threat of freezing the federal fund, like, I was the one that, like, I'm not freaking out, because in Texas, we've been in trenches on these conversations before. And so I think when I saw the letter, like, I'm not surprised. Like, we knew, like, yes, Texas is Texas. But I think that I see what's been happening in Texas, for many, many years. So when I see this come into the federal level, it's like, well, it was just a matter of time. And this is the time that it comes. Right. So I remember, talking to my manager, my team, my friends about it. And I was just like, yeah, I'm not numb. I don't think numb, that's the right feeling. But I think it's like, we knew it was coming down the pipeline. It's going to happen at the federal level at some point. And now we're here. Right.
Yeah. Now we're here. Each of us in our roles have an institutional impact, whether it be through in the classroom, grant programs, HR, what have you, library. I really want to talk about these non-binding suggestions. This, in essence, was a strongly worded letter. And you mentioned a term, Sylvia, best practices. And ultimately, what they're saying is you should think about this if you want to keep your federal funding. And if you don't want to be at risk of losing that and us weaponizing the full weight of the federal government behind it. How does that impact the work that you do? If you're in the classroom, grant programs, what have you, how do these non-binding suggestions impact your daily work?
It's sort of interesting. The way it impacts me the most directly and immediately is in the classroom, because I use, political news all the time to talk about the larger issues we're discussing in class. And so, there's always something to talk about, but sort of similar to my whole reaction to this is one partially of confusion, particularly when we get to the suggestions. My favorite example is they spend a good deal of time talking about unlawful proxies. So saying what you can't do is try to get around the rules and the laws as we interpret them by, for example, trying to increase the number of students of color at your university or college by instead using income, but really sneakily trying to achieve a racial, accomplishment here. Part of what's very funny about this from a political science perspective is one thing the administration has also done is the federal government is no longer going to use disparate impact in its interpretation of things. So basically the idea being if the government has a seemingly neutral policy or a company is doing some seemingly neutral policy, but it has a really clear impact on one racial group that's very different than others, that could be taken into account in saying we need to remedy this problem because it's impacting people differently. They're not going to use that, but the unlawful proxy section requires using a kind of disparate impact analysis so that you say you're trying to, for example, just get more low income students in, but we've noticed that you're getting more students of color. So they're doing a kind of disparate impact analysis to determine that something shady is going on. Though how they prove that, they sort of hint at the problem of not being able to do that. So it gets very confusing. And I think part of the point is that confusion, because it makes institutions scared and feel like they need to take whatever kind of action is laid out to avoid any potential problem.
Absolutely.
Well, I think when we talk about practical impact, I don't know about you all, but I'm a higher ed professional practitioner. I was not trained to read policies and laws and, reading all these memos and how that impact the work that I do. The only time that I ever get to do that was when I was working on Title IX stuff at Texas A&M and when I was at Northeastern Illinois, where I was overseeing Title IX programs in collaboration with the general counsel, right? And so that was the only time. But other than that, like I don't know, like it's kind of something interesting, like in higher ed professional, in our higher ed program, right? We never really talk about policy. And so like the practical impact is for practitioners. Like we now have
public policy.
Public policy. Okay. Like we have to teach ourselves on spots. Like, our professors in higher ed program is like, oh, this is how you support students. But by the way, you're going to know how to read these policies too. Right. Read between the lines. What is non-binding and what is binding? Right. Unless you're in the Model United Nations and you know what binding is. Right. So I think that's one thing, that immediate practical impact that we see for practitioners here at the college. And when I say college, not just Oakton, right, but everywhere.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because I never thought of it that way. I always felt like I, in some ways, was expected to know public policy. In some ways, sort of, I guess you could say I tried to teach myself how to engage in it in a way that informed my work. But that's a big reason why we keep asking Keith back to the show. Yeah. Because it's like, how do you break this down for those that may not always know how to read between the lines or know what the terms mean? So I think it's interesting because that philosophy may apply to many of us.
Right. And the one thing I want to add to Dear's point, though, is that, having to become an expert about policy, we use databases. Erick, Erick had the Erick education research database that we have subscribed to. There was a lapse, right? Because DOJ was like, oh, this is somewhere where we could cut funds. And so when you don't have access to databases, if you don't have access to knowledge and information, you can't become that expert.
Right. Right. That's the ERIC.
ERIC, correct. Mm-hmm. And that happened in April, like mid-April, right? It was lapsed for a week. Yeah. I think.
And so they cut off the data.
And then they just, Department of Education's, restarted it, and that's great. But that's a tangible risk, like that can happen tomorrow if DOJ decides to, tomorrow, in a week, in a month, that if DOJ decides to say that, oh no, we need to cut funds, right? That's a tangible risk for all of us as educators.
Right. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about statements. That was pretty glaring in the letter. If you read it, if any of our listeners have read it, you'll discover that statements are a big part of it. Trainings are a big part of it as well. And we are an institution with a number of diversity statements. And I want to talk about those because there are many people who see the value in them, but then there are others, and perhaps even some of the same people, who also feel like they can be very performative. And some people have begged the question, what is the sense of these statements? And we read them and we talk about them, but we may not always be addressing the problems that they're intended to recognize and to uplift. And so my question isn't about the statements that we have. It's about ones that we don't always talk about as much. And in particular, the non-discrimination statement. So we have a non-discrimination statement, but my question to you is, should we be saying that in public spaces? Do we need to be reading our non-discrimination statements at board meetings or at gatherings and large events? And in what ways will that serve a purpose that could either be in compliance and or resistance to what we're seeing in this letter? What do you think?
I think it's the intent versus impact. That's something I struggle as facilitators myself as well when I present at conferences and we have to read the land acknowledgement. And I'm like, well, I just land. I mean, I just arrived to the conference site and I have 5 minutes before I present. Like I haven't had a chance to study like which land I'm standing on or whatnot. And so for me, like if I don't take the time to understand what I'm reading, then I'm not going to read I'm not going to read it. Right. And so I think it depends on the context.
It's not natural. It's not authentic, natural. Right.
And as facilitator, I want to show up as my full self when I facilitate. Going back to your question, Rick, I think it depends on the context. I would read it, but I also, if I read it, then I have to know what I'm talking about.
Right.
Because if I'm reading, I can't explain why am I reading this out loud? Then that is nothing more than just being performative.
Yeah.
So should we read it? Absolutely. But the person who's reading it needs to understand the context and the why, because you're going to be the one answering it.
Right.
And if you're not comfortable reading it, it's okay. You can just blast it in the, on the screen and just explain that, read it. And that's it. So that's how
you're kind of saying, like, don't just read it, own it.
Yes.
Right?
Read it and own it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I mean, I agree. Like, performance, like what does a performance statement do? If it's just a performance, then you go home and you clock out, or you just remove yourself from that situation or that conference or that presentation, and you take nothing from it, right? Like, or that individual or those people don't, they get nothing from it. So what's the point? The point of having these statements if there's no impact, right?
No. Let's stay on the M10 impact thing for a second. Is that an objective idea or thought, or is it an assumption that we have these statements, but we're not really doing much? And the reason I ask that is because sometimes I always say that I am a purpose-driven and data-informed practitioner. I am not data-driven. I am purpose-driven, and then the data informs the work that I do. And the reason I say that is because I see the purpose in our land acknowledgement, but also the data tells us that our indigenous, Native American, First Nations, those folks are the least represented in both student and employee populations at Oakton. And so from a data standpoint, it's like, all right, well, what are we really doing this for, even if I really intend to it? So I guess my counter question is, do they hold some level of importance? And if so, where does that importance stop before it gets into being, like, where does the line draw before it gets to or is it inherently performative? I
think those statements are a very unique opportunity to inform the community of the community's history. Like, if anything comes out of those statements is that. If you didn't know what land you're on, now you do.
Now you do.
And what are you going to do about it? How are you going to be an ally? Step up. That becomes the onus.
So it should be something that propels you to action, to think differently.
Of course. Yeah. Oh, of course.
Keith, what do you think about the non-discrimination idea?
I think it's tricky because I think in one sense, what the letter wants, obviously, what they're mostly talking about is like for when you have job postings, having certain language that's, describes your non-discrimination policy and that's being followed. I was just thinking while others were responding that in class today, we were literally talking about civil liberties. And one of the cases that comes up are students who refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance in class, and some for religious reasons, other rationales. And then it gets into this question of, what good is a forced Pledge of Allegiance, right? So, like, we're all saying it. I'm requiring you to say it, but does it have any meaning at that point?
And if I could just interject real quick, the forced physical, the forced idea of how we're supposed to physically show up when we
right. And so, I mean, I think that non-discrimination statements in some contexts make a lot of sense, and I think particularly where that is especially relevant. I think that statements of all kinds are clearly performative, but we do lots of performative things precisely to show what our virtues and values are, and I think that that's worthwhile. So I think it is about balancing a bunch of different things, thinking about the particular context, thinking about, in this case, avoiding possible, punitive action by the federal government in certain contexts, but really taking and making sure that, because non-discrimination, even if we don't agree, for example, with the exact interpretation being offered here, the values expressed by civil rights legislation in the United States that people should not face discrimination because of these protected identities is something that we do value. And so we do want that to exist. And so figuring out how to make that as real as possible is certainly worthwhile.
Yeah. Let's talk about real impact. That's a great segue. I want to talk about our federal programs. We have a number of federal programs that are grant funded, and they impact students in a major way, particularly our Compass grant, our TRIO grant, and some of the other areas that are touched by those grants. I want to talk specifically about institutionalization. What are these kinds of suggestions? What is this letter? What is this environment? What does that signify for long-term sustainability of these institutional level DEI efforts? We know about what they're saying about the physical spaces, what they're saying about statements and things of that nature, even trainings. But what about those statement programs, right? Like I was an academic support services kid. I don't know where I'd be without the Lawton grant. I don't know where I'd be without, TRIO and Upward Bound and those kinds of programs. They really did save my career, my college career, which then led to who I am today. So let's talk about the long-term impact of this environment on programs such as those.
Well, I think for us to think about long-term impact, we really need to think about what institutionalization for the college really means, right? Because when we're talking about federal funding, for example, AANAPISI grant, it is a discretionary fund. What that means is that it's a seed money. Once the money runs out, you're going to have to figure it out whether you want to keep your projects or not. It's like an entrepreneur incubator type of approach, right? Yeah. And so,
great example.
A lot of times is that these institutions keep reapplying for AANAPISI and HSI over and over and over again, just because there's monies available, but they never really sit down and talk about like, how do we sustain some of these impactful programs in the long term? And so when we think about institutionalization, I like to challenge folks to think beyond than just putting a permanent staff. Can we talk about the campus culture, some of the practices that can be embedded into other existing offices? What happened when TRIO goes away? TRIO provides major services and support where, personalized academic advising, personalized resume workshops and things like that, similar to other offices. So how can we, when those funding goes away, how can we make sure that we are able to support the students if and when the federal funding is gone? And so I think when we're talking about long-term protecting DEI program, we need to start thinking about moving away, not just personal dollars, but how we do our work. Can there be overlapping in terms of collaborating between TRIO office and maybe current equity programs that are on campus?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm sure they are, right?
Where are the partnerships?
Where are the partnerships? And if the TRIO goes away, can these equity programs be able to absorb the students in some capacity? Because institutionalization does not mean you have to absorb all components of the program. It can be parts of the program. It can be parts of funding. And I think we don't talk about it much from the federal level, where we keep relying on these federal dollars and we see not just student services program, but also like research.
Yeah, but does that have I see what you're saying, but does that have, and this is really a question for everybody, if that were to happen, what do you think the impact would be on the people who serve the students, the employees, the staff? Do we risk burnout in those cases? Do we risk, the students who have maybe, or people who have maybe a 10 student caseload, now you got a 30 student caseload, or you had one program that you were expected to run, now you have 10. And now I'm looking for a different place to work that may be able to support what I do, which then affects the quality of experience for students. If something like that happens, what would be the reverse effect that it would have essentially on the higher ed workforce?
Thoughts? Because I can totally jump right in.
Go for it.
Well, I think this is where innovation has to come, right? We may have to reimagine how we do our work.
Yeah.
Yes. Absorbing program does not mean that you have to take two people's job for one, no, you don't. But you have to reimagine an optics. I remember when I was working at Northeastern Illinois University, where I pretty much absorbed all gender and sexuality programs. In the past, before the budget impasse in 2018, there were like these affinity spaces. But because of budget shortfall in Illinois at that time, all programs were absorbed. And I just learned there's no way I'm doing 3 cultural center job, right? So what I did was I optics. Like we have a signature program, keep it simple. So that way I don't feel the burnout, but also allow myself to be creative and waiting for more funding to come. Yeah, so I think the question is, for us to think about, can we be innovative? We need to move away from because it was done in the past. And if it didn't work, we shouldn't go back. Maybe it's time for us to go back to our drawing board. Because we are now in a different time. We got to be creative somewhere, Yeah. I think.
Yeah, I agree. I remember that budget shortfall as well. And we did have to get quite innovative with some of the ways that we did our work. And so I think you're right. It may have to look differently. We may have to reimagine. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I also think it's one of the things that's very difficult about this is, and we're seeing this play out with lots of the court cases that are going on, even in instances where federal funds are being returned or supposed to be returned and it's being appealed. The uncertainty that's been created is an uncertainty that is certainly going to last largely for the rest of this administration, but there's also no way to know what it means to, quote, return to normal because, there's just
no
what
is
way.
Normal?
Right. What is that going to look like?
Yeah.
We just have so little clue right now that I think that thinking creatively and, you hear universities looking to have specific programs supported by private capital. You have people trying to increase their relationships with state funding and all kinds of other things. But the reality is that things have changed and are certainly going to keep changing before they stabilize. And so being creative, I think, is exactly what the answer is.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, what is normal in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, 6 years after. So being creative, I think Dear absolutely nailed that.
Yeah. What is normal
in the next
3 to 5 days?
Right. Yeah. Right.
At the rate we've seen, we know that change can happen quickly, which leads us to our last question. Change is happening quickly and rapidly, and we are responding to things in real time. As practitioners, as people who do this work, and let's even think broader than just diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is the work of humanity. This is mission-based work. We get into this because somewhere along the way, I don't know about you, but I when you asked me if I was 5, if I wanted to be a higher education administrator, I didn't know what that was. I wanted to be Superman like everybody else, right? But somewhere along the way, we fell in love with this profession, and it has had an impact on our lives. And now the very nature of what we do is under attack in one way or another. What are some of your final thoughts to practitioners, to the people at Oakton, the people beyond Oakton that are engaged in this work each and every day, those that are under the fire, those that are dealing with students, those that are dealing with their own realities? What are some of your final thoughts that you can offer for how practitioners can remain resilient during these times?
I mean, for me, you could take away the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right?
Yep.
But I'm still here.
That's right.
I'm still in this space.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm still committed to representing my student population. And that's going to be reflected in the programming I do, in the collection and development that I procure for the library.
Yep.
I'm still here.
I'm still here.
Right? I'm still here. And hopefully the students will see that. Even if the language has to, or if I'm forced to change the language, right? I'm still here. What concerns me for the future, what about those students who were considering information science for the future? Will they still see that as a opportunity to, or as a, degree route for themselves, right? That's what I'm thinking about right now, is that those students who have an inclination towards information science to become the next librarian specialist, to become the next, Sylvia in a different community college, will they have that opportunity? Yeah.
Curators and keepers of information, which is so important.
And not gatekeeping information, y'all. It's but but we don't want to gatekeep information. That's why we have access to all these databases, and that's why we do collection development. But definitely I want to ensure, that's the concern I have. What's this impact for information science in the next 10 years? Because the consequences are going to be long past this administration, right? So but I'm still here, and hopefully our students still see that. And that's part of the reason why I came to Oakton, right? It's because I saw my experience reflected in our students' experience. Yeah. And I was like, well, what can I do? Yeah. And I feel like I've been doing an okay job, and the students turn out. When they see themselves reflected in programming, they'll turn out, and they'll come up to us. They'll come up to Dear. They'll come up to me and be like, oh my God, this is amazing. Filipino night market, Asian night market. Yeah. These programs are amazing. And that's what being part of a community college is. So as long as we're still here, I think, but are we still going to be here? Are we still going to be allowed the opportunity to be here? That's the question, right? Yeah. So as long as I'm here, I'm here.
As long as I'm here, I'm here.
So
yeah, excellent. Well stated.
Well stated. I don't know how I'm supposed to top that, but I think, I think there's so many things I want to say. I think because we're living in a very polarized, politicized climate, that we forgot the true mission of college education. The idea is we're supposed to be we are open to everybody. And even when we get our federal dollars, our grant officer says, yes, your program has, specific intentions, but your program is supposed to be welcoming to everybody. Yeah. And so now we at the era where people forget the true mission of what higher education is about. And for schools that get federal dollars, we're very clear. We have to welcome to everybody. And so I think that we're in a very interesting time where we have to be informed. And so going back to the original question, I'm worried about the young DEI practitioner, new higher professionals. How do they navigate that? Yeah. And they look to their leaders.
What do you say to them right now?
What do you say to them? What do you advise them? When I met the new equity coordinators for API and Andale, they're like, I don't know what I'm doing, dear. My manager is so helpful, but what does that even mean? Right. And so how do we mentor and keep these young professionals be energized and sustain in the profession? I think that is going to be the primary challenge that we're facing, because folks are leaving higher ed because we don't trust higher ed right now.
Right. And they're the most vulnerable too. Because
these young professionals are the most vulnerable because no disrespect, right? But like we look up to leaders and leaders don't even know it themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that because we are in a very different time. But I think how do we sustain these young professionals to be in the profession?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge that we're facing right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very, very well said.
Mm-hmm.
What Dear just said made me think of an example. I'll be showing part of a video next week from the documentary Eyes on the Prize. And this is specifically Classic. This episode is about the Little Rock Nine and the fight over desegregation in schools. And one of the reasons I like to show that in class is these are high school students who are really risking their lives to, make the promise of, there's also the great line where Thurgood Marshall, who's at the time a lawyer for the NAACP, gets asked if he and his supporters need to be more patient. And he says, well, it's been 90 odd years since the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. We've been pretty patient.
Yeah.
But like having these students just literally put their lives on the line in a much just amazingly difficult context just does make me think that the young people who are in these difficult circumstances now can find a way. They do need support and they need to be helped. But young people have found a way through very, very difficult historical analogs in some ways. And so, figuring out the best way we can make that easier and support them in doing that is really something that I think we can help with. But they find a way.
Yeah, they're resilient.
My thought is to keep showing up, is to show up every day, even when it's difficult and you're wondering about what your next move is or what your next thought may be or what may happen. Showing up for the work and the cause every day, even if it means showing up in a different space, even if it means showing up in a different job or a different title. I think sometimes I myself in my own experience have really gotten attached to the terms, because in my opinion, you can't legislate away humanity. And so whether you call it DEI, before it was DEI, it was multicultural programs. Before it was multicultural programs, it was diversity. Before it was diversity, it was affirmative action. Before it was affirmative action, it was civil rights. Before civil rights, it was freedom. We've always had language to put around the fight, but the fight has always been there. And so while this may be a relatively new profession, in contrast to some of the others that we see along the organizational lines, right? The idea of this work, the work that's been done, is a tale as old as time. And so for the young professionals, I think about them a lot too, because I always say that I felt like I was doing this work even before I knew what it was. But now that there's a growing active profession, you now have young people that are really discouraged about going into them. Even for those, I know someone that's in their maybe third or fourth year and that has been doing DEI work in higher ed for their career so far. And they are very anxious about what's going to happen. Maybe I should be getting this certificate. Maybe I should be moving into this area. And so a lot of my conversations, have gone from how you navigate the work to how you navigate the anxiety around the work and what that means for you and your families. And so when I say keep showing up, I don't just mean physically, I also mean mentally and emotionally and spiritually as well. And not to give up on the work even when it's under attack. Keith, Dear, Sylvia, thanks for joining the show.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Critical Conversations podcast is recorded at Oakton College, located at 1600 East Gulf Road, Des Plaines, Illinois. The show is sponsored in part by the Oakton College Educational Foundation, produced by Erick, Rohn, coordinated by Brenda, Cruz, and hosted by Dr. Rick Daniels. For more information or to connect with us, email critsconpod@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more Critical Conversations.